I'm David Greenberg. I'm a professor of history at Rutgers University. I'm the author of Republic of Spin, an Inside History of the American Presidency. And I also write a lot for journalistic outlets, popular outlets like Politico, where I'm a contributing editor, and from time to time weigh in on political issues. I don't think you'll find too much argument that 2016 was a historic election. It was full of surprises, unpredicted happenings from the first to the last, including, of course, Donald Trump's victory. And I think it's going to take us some time to really see how long-lasting the impacts and consequences are. But for starters, Trump completely upended the Republican Party. Here was someone who ran for the nomination of a party that's had a very, fairly rigid conservative orthodoxy, and deviating from it typically spelled death. Trump bucked the orthodoxy in any number of ways, emerged victorious, and in a way that's not fully recognized still, then managed to bring back into the fold in the fall campaign all of these people who didn't want him to get the nomination in the first place. In all the analyses of why Trump won, probably the least credited phenomenon is that most Romney voters and McCain voters and Bush voters ended up voting for Trump after all. That was the lion's share of his base. So yes, there were Democratic swing voters, white working class voters who swung over to him. But if he had gotten them and hadn't secured the Republican base, he wouldn't have won either. I think Trump's victory is also historic in that here is a guy who basically ignored, flouted, shredded virtually every norm and expectation of civil democratic behavior, and was not only not punished, but rewarded for it. From not releasing his taxes to engaging in a level of personal vituperation that we just don't typically see in face-to-face politics. The level of just kind of casual mendacity. I mean, we've had plenty of politicians who've told lies, who've told fibs, but the kind of sheer recklessness, indifference to the truth as he's kind of barreled his way through. And you know, one could go through any number of other reasons. And I think this has left a lot of people, including me, concerned about what this means for democracy. I'm as concerned about what has happened with Trump as about what will happen. I have my concerns about what will happen. But the fact that so many of our democratic norms were violated, discarded, really makes you feel the fragility of our democracy in a way that I just haven't felt in my lifetime. So I think in all those ways, it's certainly a historic election. And then probably in 2, 4, 6 years, we'll be able to see other ways as well. The question of Clinton's loss is kind of difficult to answer without reference to Trump's win. I mean, clearly a Hillary Clinton victory would have been historic in its own way, quite obviously. She would have been our first female president. And her candidacy itself, you know, should not, you know, the historic nature of it, her having secured the nomination, the first woman to secure the nomination, should not be minimized, even though she ultimately lost. So there is that. What does her loss mean for the Democratic Party? Here, I'm not so sure. There's a lot of talk, a number of articles written, well, Clintonism is dead, or the Clinton-Obama Democratic Party is dead. I actually don't think that's true. I think it's under threat. I think there's going to be pressures on the Democratic Party to go more in a hard left direction of Sanders. much the way Labour in Britain has gone under Jeremy Corbyn. But I don't think, I mean, one doesn't know, but I don't think we're quite going to go there. I think there's going to be a fight on in the Democratic Party about whether a moderate liberal orientation can prevail over a more left populistic orientation. But that's something that I don't think this election has decided. I think this election we've seen the outlines, we've seen the debate begin to play out, but it's really going to play out in the years ahead. I think historians definitely have a major role to play now in bringing to bear on our current political situation a knowledge of Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany, of other moments in the history of democracy when it has been imperiled, when it has died. So I think there's a lot to be considered and perhaps learned from the past. I'm not someone who believes that history teaches lessons in any kind of clear and neat way. So what exactly we take from that study of history is hard to say precisely. But I do think, there were historians of Nazi Germany, of fascism, who made their voices heard during the campaign with, I think, a sensitivity and subtlety that was valuable. I don't think we've had a single president who hasn't been accused of being a fascist. At some point, it was used against Bush, it was used against Reagan. And in a way that devalued the term a little bit, so when people have tried to apply it to Trump, there's a sense of, well, is this just sloganeering? And I've been reluctant to use the term fascism, at least to say Trump is a fascist. I think it's fair to say he has authoritarian tendencies. I think some might even want to say he has fascistic tendencies. We are not yet, at least, at the point where liberal constitutional democracy has been suspended and we're at fascism. And yet I do think with Trump, the meaning of the term is now important to understand as something other than a slogan that liberals throw at conservatives, just as socialism is coming to be understood again as something other than a term that conservatives throw at liberals. When does it apply? Why does it apply? And I think these are questions that historians are going to be called upon to answer and discuss in a lot more detail and care than they have been in a long time. I think ultimately the job of historians is to study and write about and talk about the past, wherever that leads. That is, I think it's important to draw a bright line between our work as historians and then our political engagement as citizens. All that said, those, whether it's historians or anybody else who want to avail themselves of the knowledge of what fascism looks like, what it has looked like in the past, about how democracies weaken, need to study history and need to turn to the insights and the knowledge that historians provide. So there's obviously a close relationship there. So yes, what historians can do is to make known, publicize their knowledge. And I think there's a kind of marketplace of ideas by which this happens. Op-ed editors, book publishers, they see the political world we're living in now. So they turn to the people with those knowledge bases and those areas of expertise. And by turns, those who have that expertise, reach out to the public. And two, you also see the phenomenon whereby which younger historians coming up will be drawn to these areas, that some fields of study that we thought might be I wouldn't say defunct or obsolete, but, played out, become relevant in new ways. I mean, I was just discussing with some colleagues the whole rich body of history that's been produced in the last 20 years on conservatism, on American conservatism, the rise from, Goldwater to Reagan or to George W. Bush, what have you. And it seems clear that even though it's a magnificent body of scholarship, that some of it now is going to seem, I wouldn't say dated, but useful in explaining American history up to a certain point in time. And we now need to find other strains of conservatism that have brought us Donald Trump. So one piece I did write recently in Politico tried to take Trumpism seriously. Maybe we can't quite say it's a full-fledged ideology. Trump is too inconsistent and too mercurial to really ascribe to him a fully coherent ideology. And all the same, there are certain core ideas that he ran on and consistently expressed that do add up to something like an ideology in a loose sense, which I see as kind of what we used to call paleoconservatism. The certain strains of conservatism that were marginalized by William F. Buckley, by Ronald Reagan, that were at least kept on the fringes of the conservative movement, that didn't become mainstream. And now they're at the heart of it, or at least at the heart of this president's vision for the country. So I think we're going to be revisiting that paleoconservative strand of thought, of policy, that has been written about but hasn't gotten the same attention as, say, neoconservatism has gotten. Starting after World War II, there was a kind of discrediting of isolationism in foreign policy. The Republican Party more or less agreed on an internationalist foreign policy, animated by anti-communism above all. But that was a real break from the Charles Lindbergh, William Randolph Hearst, America First, pre-World War II vision. And of course, Trump ran on America First, ran on, if not scuttling NATO, at least withdrawing from NATO, ran on sort of overturning a lot of these premises of even Republican internationalism. Globalization had sort of been accepted really by both parties as this is the way of the future. Trump was anti-globalist. There had been a marginalization of certain avowedly racist and anti-Semitic ideas. Certainly the anti-Semitism by the end of World War II, the racism by the end of the civil rights movement, that are now, if not quite openly espoused, they're at least much more robust and talked about and available in the public discourse. We saw on issues of Wall Street and finance a kind of populism that we more typically associate with left populism also exists on the right, and this had sort of been part of paleoconservatism too. You see precursors of it, for example, in the 2008 TARP, the bailout. People may recall that the House Republicans rejected George Bush and Hank Paulson's initial bailout plan, that there was this anti-Wall Street, anti-high finance sentiment that had taken hold on the conservative side that really, hadn't been there for a long time. And Trump, of course, picked up on that too, although as he makes his cabinet choices and so on, we'll see how far he really goes with that. So I think all of these are elements of paleoconservative. We identify people like Pat Buchanan, perhaps Phyllis Schlafly. There were certainly major figures in conservatism who are associated with the paleocon vision, but by and large, they weren't the ones who were the most influential. And occasionally, even in the last 10 or 15 years, a magazine like the National Review would have someone like Ann Coulter write a piece saying, well, we need to, bomb Afghanistan and convert all the Muslims to Christianity, and, would be fired from the magazine. Other people suffered this fate as well. So even very right-wing organs were kind of policing the boundaries of acceptable discourse in ways that made certain concessions to, the liberal world that we lived in. And now those voices are back. They went to other sites like Breitbart and even fringier websites like VDare and Talkies. And, this is kind of an arcane area. But those voices, kind of with Twitter, with social media, with the internet, have kind of re-entered the discourse with a prominence that they just have not enjoyed in a very long time. So I wrote this book, Republic of Spin, that came out in January of 2016. And as a result, it doesn't explicitly cover the 2016 campaign. It hadn't happened yet. And on my book tour, I would just consistently get questions about Donald Trump, who is not in the book. But these questions forced me to grapple with, well, what is Trump doing with spin that is new, and what is he doing that is familiar? Certainly, I think the most obvious tool that has distinguished Trump has been Twitter. And the thing that people say about Trump with Twitter is, well, this gives him a direct pipeline to say what he wants to his followers without the interference of the media. I mean, that I think is not at all what's significant about Twitter. That's something presidents have always been able to do. They can give a speech on primetime television and they get their voice heard. They could issue, going back to Theodore Roosevelt, a press release, and that is their statement in the presidential voice. So the presidential capacity for direct communication has actually been with us for a long time. What Twitter does is actually something different. I mean, what do we associate with Twitter? Sort of the main thing, or one of the main things, is the Twitter war. These kinds of sharp, pointed, often insulting exchanges that people get into that go back and forth. And because of the nature of the social medium, what two people are writing to each other can be seen by everyone who subscribes to either of those people's Twitter feeds. And so the raw anger, it's the same anger and emotion that comes through in a comment on an article posted to the web or in a dashed off email, that there's no barrier that forces reflection and restraint before the sentiment is sent out for public consumption. And that's what Trump really does with Twitter, is these fired off, emotional, often angry, short provocations. That really is where his voice and the medium of Twitter have kind of converged in effectiveness. So I think about other media when they were new. And typically the pattern is there's one president or politician who uses the medium, but then it falls to someone a little bit later to really take advantage of what's special about that medium. So if you just think about radio, I wrote this little book on Calvin Coolidge saying people fail to credit Coolidge with, he was the one who gave the first inaugural on the radio, the first nomination acceptance address, the first State of the Union on the radio. But what he didn't do was write a speech for radio that was any different from a speech he would normally give. He just sort of hooked up a wire and a microphone and gave a speech, and he could reach California and he could reach St. Louis, but he wasn't innovating with the form. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, with the fireside chat, has a new form. They're short, they're intimate, he uses colloquial language. He really does something with radio that Coolidge could never do. And by the same token, Obama had his White House Twitter feed, and that got talked about, and it was kind of significant. But is there any tweet of Obama's that we remember, right? I mean, he basically used it as a way of issuing very short press releases, which is fine. But it was Trump who kind of came up with a new way to exploit what was really distinctive about Twitter. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing I'll say, just briefly, is Trump also used a technique that I associate with Joe McCarthy. I'm sure there have been other people over the years who have been adept at using it, which is to recognize a certain quality that the news media, especially television, have of sort of chasing after sort of the newest headlines. And what McCarthy would do would be to accuse you of being a communist, and then for 3 days everybody would be investigating this. Is this true? Is this not true? And by the time they realized, no, you're not a communist, McCarthy would be accusing someone else. He'd be on to the next thing. And it was a way of sort of keeping the spotlight on him, keeping himself in the headlines. And this is really what Trump did too. And the fact that he would say things that he either knew to be untrue or didn't care if they were true, didn't matter. He sort of would say these things, they would serve their purpose, they would get him the attention, and then by the time they were discredited, he could be on to the next thing. And he really used this technique, I think, very effectively, especially in the primaries. I mean, in the fall campaign, he sort of didn't need this to keep the spotlight on him because it was already there. Especially during the primaries, he managed to sort of hog the attention, so contenders for the nomination just simply never got the oxygen that they would have needed, I think, to put up a credible competitive threat. It's interesting how the phenomenon of fake news really emerged after the election as a kind of retrospective answer, one of many answers of what happened, how did Trump win. And I actually think its importance in the ranking of causes is probably lower than has been suggested. There was one piece, I think the Washington Post did, with an inventor of fake news who claimed, not really on the basis of anything, saying, oh, I think I caused Trump to win. And it sort of planted this idea that it was a decisive element. Whether these invented stories were really as important, or to put it this way, I don't think these invented stories were as important as partisan news, which is something we've had for a long time, with news that has been filtered through such a sharp partisan and ideological filter that it creates perceptions that are just really widely at variance from one another depending on the audience and its reading habits. I mean, I do think that there is, when so much of the public believes that Hillary Clinton is more dishonest than Donald Trump, that can only be attributable to a media failure of some sort. Now, that's not to say it was journalistic irresponsibility, although I think there was some of that in the overhyping of the email server scandal and so on. But it was also a reflection of the patterns of news consumption that have taken hold in the last 20 years. First through the rise of talk radio and Fox News and partisan cable news, and then through social media and the reinforcement of ideological predilections through our news feeds and Twitter feeds and that kind of thing. Now, since then, this term fake news has just kind of gotten degraded to be just kind of an insult. This is just news that I think is wrong, or a viewpoint I think is wrong, or that omits a certain key fact. But that's a very different use of the term. And some people have said that even using fake news in its earlier sense, maybe we should use words like disinformation, misinformation, false story. That there might be ways of pinpointing exactly what's being done. Fake news could be a lot of things. Fake news could be the onion. There was a time when we used this phrase, and people know it's fake. So there's no danger, of course, if people recognize it as fake. Now, there's also a history of false news, including news that is presented as true but is known to be fake. And a former student of mine who's a professor at Marist College, Kevin Lerner, is writing a piece now on this great hoax called The Report from Iron Mountain. It was actually written by Victor Navasky when he was a young journalist as a kind of joke, but it was then taken seriously by these right-wing militia movements, and sort of around the time of the Timothy McVeigh bombing kind of got all this attention. And sometimes things that are kind of invented not for malicious purposes, but nonetheless become believed. You could go back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a kind of fake news, right? So we've had a long tradition of falsehoods being disseminated as truth. And I think we have to be sort of careful in trying to identify, well, what are we worried about today? And I think it has to do with actually the channels of media and news consumption, and the fear that people in certain environments, parts of the country, neighborhoods, ideological communities are reading only or overwhelmingly, particularly slanted news. And that's happening on the right, but it's also happening on the left. And the loss of a larger kind of common ground that, well, we all can sort of agree that, even if we might argue with interpretations and argue with presentation, we can all agree that what we read in the morning's paper, what we saw on the nightly news broadcast is the news and is broadly speaking true, not to say infallible. But that sort of common reference point feels like it's being lost. There certainly have been other times in our history when we have lacked a kind of common consensus on what the news is. And as people know, the 19th century newspapers were highly partisan, and you could read an account of the same event in two different newspapers, one Democratic, one Republican, and think they were witnessing two different events. So there are kind of historical precedents in some ways for this moment. I think when you combine the erosion of kind of common ground in the realm of news and information with a figure like Trump, who kind of openly encourages his followers, or all Americans, if they'll listen to him, to disregard established authorities, that makes it all the harder to kind of restore any kind of common basis, even for arguments, let alone agreement. Now, I think this is a long time coming. I have written in the past about the Bush administration was a time when conservatives sort of openly embraced an assault on expertise and an assault on constituted authorities, whether in the realm of climate science, whether in the realm of evolutionary biology, which of course goes back much further than that. You started to see the authority that, say, a group like the American Bar Association was once accorded in evaluating Supreme Court nominees, that was denigrated. No, it's a liberal organization. They don't give conservatives a fair shake. And in fact, I sort of trace this back to the Nixon years, that Nixon really was the one who first saw the entire establishment of what were really non-ideological, non-partisan institutions of professional and scholarly expertise. He saw them as all kind of part of the liberal establishment and sought to erect a conservative counter-establishment. And so there were new conservative societies formed. The Federalist Society in law comes out of the Heritage Foundation, and they become able to sort of populate the ranks of government with people who reject, kind of on ideological grounds, the kind of consensual beliefs and replace them with ideologically informed conclusions. And I think the danger now is that which already was a problem by the Bush years is going just to intensify and accelerate.